Welcome everyone, bienvenidos, buenas noches. Before we begin, I want to ask those of you who have a preference for the Spanish language to click on the globe on the bottom right of your screen within Zoom, just as it shows on our slide. Your interpreters are Luis and Andres, and they are really good. So I don't want you to miss their great translation. Bienvenidos a todos. Por los que prefieren español, tenemos una opción que hagan clic en el globe en la pantalla a su derecha. Sus intérpretes son Luis y Andrés, y ellos son excelentes en lo que hacen. So, espero que disfruten y sea una sesión súper productiva. And also, I wanted to acknowledge today our ancestors and the original stewards of this land. We claim this space to acknowledge the Tangva land. Yes, these statements are only a stepping stone to recognizing broken treaties to the native people of the sacred land. However, I honor them as my ancestors and respect and value the many ways their cultural heritage and beliefs continue to manifest in our lives today. In invoking my ancestors, it reminds us all about the sacred and spiritual relationship that has always existed on this land. We acknowledge the Tangva people as the traditional land caretakers of LA and the Basin and the Southern Channel Islands. Awishko Mahili Ataman. Thank you, ancestors. Gracias, abuelos y ancestros, por el patrimonio. Juremos protegerlo de nuevo. So once again, good evening and thank you for joining the Climate Equity LA series on session 2 of Equitable Building and Home Decarbonization. I want to thank everyone for their contributions and hard work to move the agenda of equitable climate policy forward and for being here this evening with us. I am Marta Segura, the founding director of the first and only Climate Emergency Mobilization Office in the nation. Our office launched here in the city of Los Angeles, early February 2021. We have some amazing presenters tonight to dialogue with you, respond to questions and answers with you, because we want to hear from you. Also, please use the chat space to pose questions and comments in English or Spanish. We will be posting the program for the series in the chat space as well. I want to thank the Liberty Hill Foundation, our lead partner, for helping us create and execute this 3-part series. I want to thank the anchor organizations like CBE, Scope, SAGE, PSRLA, Pacoima Beautiful, Lane, and Leap LA Coalition, and our allies like NCSA, the neighborhood councils, the mayor's public engagement team, and UCLA, and so many others who are facilitating and note-taking tonight and helping us to promote the series. I also want to thank our curriculum design committee. We must collaborate and engage at all levels and across borders because climate and pollution don't recognize borders or jurisdictions. Thus, governments must be seamless as possible in the execution of our policies and our services. So in our first slide, I want to talk about why we must center the city's climate policies with equity and health at the forefront. We just can't achieve climate goals while we have an extractive economy, and that extractive economy continues to flourish without equity as a through line. We have felt the consequences, the unintended consequences of climate solutions that were poorly designed. It has happened one too many times, and there are too many examples to even begin to go down that road today. So why is Climate Equity LA a series going to address this? Our blueprint goals will put community leadership and their voices at the forefront to assure that we develop a collaborative governance structure between community stakeholders and the city of Los Angeles and create agency and leadership in our communities. This is our blueprint for change and how we will more meaningfully engage community voices at City Hall. This series is an example of bottom-up policy design, and we hope you will provide your valued input and suggestions. Systems change, however, requires a unified approach from all people at all levels. The model that we're creating is derived from resident identified needs, giving community members much more ownership over policies such as the electrification of low-income and middle-income homes, identifying financing for retrofits of older and existing buildings for our electric appliances and climate adaptation, creating a local workforce that transitions from an oil-based economy to a renewable energy economy, and finally creating microgrids in areas that can suffer the most from disasters in the event of a regional blackout. So finally, as we pull together this blueprint and pull together the data from the focus groups, from the small group breakouts, from the Q&A, and from the polling sessions, we will have a group of, in our policy committee and our design committee, review that data, and then turn that into a report that will be delivered to the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission and then our City Council. So this isn't just a dialogue or an awareness building session. We're actually going to convert your recommendations and suggestions into a report that will influence policy. So in our last slide, I'd like to say that in summary, we want to create meaningful engagement and civic-led governance strategies for equitable climate policies and investments. We want to shape recommendations for equitable climate policies as per our environmental equity metrics. And we want to coordinate and collaborate with city leaders to bring an equity lens to LA's Green New Deal and engage and mobilize communities while we're delivering an equitable climate action roadmap to the full City Council. So next, I'd like to then transition into our actual session. And opening for us today, we have some excellent speakers. And I'd like to introduce to you today both Heather Rosenberg and Cameron Hurt. Cameron is from Lane and Heather Rosenberg is from ARUP. And they will introduce themselves as well. And I want to mention one more time again for those of you who speak Spanish, that there is a Spanish globe button at the bottom that you can click. Para los que hablan español, por favor, en la pantalla a su derecha está un globo donde pueden cliquear para que escuchen el intérprete en español. So I hand it over to our presenters, Cameron Hurt and Heather Rosenberg.
Thank you so much, Martha, and very happy to be here. Good evening, everybody. My name is Cameron Hurt, and I'm a community organizer at Lane, working on the Repower LA Coalition. And Repower LA is a coalition of environmental, labor, and community-based organizations dedicated to an energy-efficient future for our city's frontline communities. And one of our top priorities, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, has been the energy burden, which has drastically impacted Angelenos, particularly in low-income, frontline, Black and Brown communities. So as with the effects of climate change in general, these communities feel the worst impacts of the energy burden, including energy price hikes. And they also feel the most about the programs to alleviate those issues. So today, I'll be talking a little bit more about how these impacts have been felt throughout the LA region and the work that's been done to counter it before passing it to Heather. We can stay on this slide for a second. Because what we found, what the research has shown is that in a recent survey of over 3,200 South LA residents, 45% of the respondents said that someone in their household was unemployed or underemployed. 47% said they had difficulty paying rent or utilities as a primary concern. So that's really showing just how much this is on the minds of people within South LA. And then another survey showed that 1 in 4 Latinx and 1 in 5 Black respondents had difficulty paying utility bills as a top concern. And over 35% of respondents identified programs that would help save on electricity costs or provide renewable energy and electricity as a priority need. So let's go ahead to the next slide, where we see these 3 maps that outline 3 different crises that are historic and very important to understand within the LA region. So we have 3 maps that show redlining and just the way that the area has just been divided and segregated along these racial lines in particular. We see the drastic impacts of environmental pollution, with the red areas being the hardest hit in the middle. And then lastly, we see some early mapping of what the COVID-19 pandemic's effects were in different communities. So we see these trends actually across these 3 maps that I think are very important to notice. And then on the next slide, we'll go into one more thing, which is essentially showing the areas that have been the hardest hit by the cost of energy. So it shows the total delinquent accounts by zip code within LA County, of course, with the darkest red being the hardest hit. So with that, taking in all of this research that's happened, we can go to the next slide, which goes ahead and shows our main goal is helping working families thrive. So entering this campaign to erase utility debt toward the end of 2020, we knew that this debt was highly concentrated in low-income Black and Brown communities, particularly parts of the Valley and South Los Angeles. At the same time, we understand that there's a complicated utility landscape, just to say the least, but there's also not a lot of options in terms of funding within utilities during this time, just due to certain state laws. So early on, we agreed to focus on the following key campaign goals, which include alleviating the financial strain of high utility bills, preventing families from facing shutoffs once the moratorium is lifted, and providing long-term resiliency through stable bills, energy efficient homes, and clean energy for historically underserved communities, as well as addressing the structural racial injustices and opening career pathways to family sustaining union jobs. And then on the right side, we see just a little bit of the, the headlines that were coming out at this time. We can go to the last slide of my section. So toward the end of 2021, as this campaign had really continued at a really fast pace, massive victories were won, like a combined $2 billion in power and water debt relief, and the longest shutoff moratorium extension in the country. We decided to put our focus on some more concrete goals, which we're still fighting for. So one was erasing utility debt accumulated before or during the COVID-19 crisis for low-income qualified customers. Two was improving outreach for existing equity-based programs and the utility debt forgiveness programs to address historic under-enrollment in these programs that could be saving Angelino's money. As well as that, we are going to fight to invest in utility justice to reduce the widespread unaffordability of LEDWP bills for low-income communities of color by creating a bill stabilization program based on monthly income. That is definitely something that would really help people. And also ensuring resources for the COVID-19 utility debt forgiveness program don't come at the expense of the essential workforce of the LEDWP or any existing low-income programs. It definitely shouldn't have to be one or the other. So it's very clear that real solutions are needed to truly alleviate the energy burden from the most impacted frontline communities. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it to Heather to take us into the case studies and the models.
Great, thank you so much, Cameron. Really great to be here. I'm Heather Rosenberg. I lead the resilience practice in Los Angeles for ARIP, which is a large consulting firm focused on sustainable development, engineering, consulting, all sorts of things like that. But it is a mission-driven, employee-owned firm focused on creating social value. And the way that we got into this, I just want to quickly say, the NRDC came to us based on a lot of work we were doing around decarbonization and asked, should affordable housing be included? And so what started out as an energy question really very quickly became a social question. And we want to just kind of go through what some of the findings were from that study and from this ongoing body of work that we've been participating in. There are a lot of equity implications related to electrification in terms of costs, labor, all sorts of things. But next slide. We specifically in this study, we're looking at the first costs and the operational costs so that you have better understanding of, what does this really potentially mean for households? Next. Everybody needs reliable energy, whether you're in the city or you're a more remote community. Everybody needs access to affordable energy and not being afraid that the power is going to be shut off. We also need to make sure that everybody has affordable rent, weatherization. That a key piece of this really is that housing is fit for purpose in the face of climate impacts. Next. Part of our study included some community engagement. I'm going to just quickly point out some of these out that because I think some of the other speakers are going to talk about this more. But there is, I think, very strong buy-in that there's a need for decarbonization and a strong consensus that it needs to not come at the expense of low-income communities who are already bearing the brunt of climate impacts. Next. Building electrification has a number of benefits in addition to costs. So it's a very important piece in terms of indoor air quality. This is particularly true for older homes that may have poor ventilation. Natural gas is not good for you and actually worse for you than people really realize now that people are actually paying attention to it. This is particularly an issue for low-income communities that are already overburdened with other environmental stressors. There's a potential for electrification to improve utility rates, lower utility rates. Certainly there's potential for safety, not plumbing our entire urban environment with flammable gas is a safety measure. Heat pumps, which is one of the main technologies that we're looking at here, actually enables both air conditioning and heating from the same system, which can be helpful, particularly as we're looking at increasing heat. And we're also concerned that if affordable housing is excluded from decarbonization measures and electrification, particularly, that those assets can become stranded because they're the only ones left holding the natural gas infrastructure. So next slide. So there are certainly potential for negative consequences, and what we're really concerned with here are increasing rent burden or utility costs, potentially triggering displacement. And on the other side, next slide, there are consequences of not including affordable housing in decarbonization efforts. Affordable housing as a sector in Los Angeles is very complicated. We have a lot of older building stock, and older building stock often is pre-code. So we don't have good performance data. We don't know what's in a lot of these buildings. We don't know where these buildings are. There's a whole complicated regulatory framework that regulated affordable housing exists in, with complicated financial requirements and capital stacks that required to make them work. But what we are seeing pretty clearly is that displacement is a risk from a whole variety of directions. Next. So just zooming in on what do we mean by electrification here, we're not just talking about replacing the stove. It will require retrofits at the building scale, often retrofitting meters and panels to make sure that the electrical capacity of the building is sufficient, and then replacing equipment. Next. And we ran a variety of models, and we looked at and separated out the energy and utility costs for both owners and tenants. So looking at common areas and central equipment for the owners, as well as in-unit equipment and appliances for tenants. And across the board, we saw that electrification in all of the models we looked at resulted in some level of energy savings. This is actually cost savings, so anywhere from 10 to even up to 30%. But what we found really significantly is that the first cost can be quite significant, and it really depends, and this is very variable. We were looking at two different buildings, one that had 31 units and one that had 62. And across the board, the first costs are likely not enough. The energy savings that we're going to see are not enough to offset potential first costs if they're fully passed on to low-income tenants. So this is just saying that another way. There are operational savings due to efficiency, but not enough to offset the potential burden of first costs. And so there needs to be a pathway that looks at affordable housing, preservation, tenants' rights, and protections, as well as decarbonization, and really marrying those two things as twin goals. To get there, we've looked at a lot of different policy mechanisms. It really will require a systemic approach that includes programs targeted at multifamily housing that address the split incentive between owners and tenants, alignment of decarbonization and housing preservation as key goals, early state and ongoing stakeholder engagement, which this is part of, and I'm really happy to see it, technical support for owners, for contractors, and then really most importantly is direct financial incentives. And again, there's a whole suite of tools. These are outlined in more detail in the report that we've compiled. But what we're really looking towards here is bottom-up market transformation. The opportunity is when we look at something like the seismic retrofit ordinance, for example, first cost passed on to tenants. We don't have good data, or I haven't seen good data. If anyone has any, please share, of whether that triggered displacement. But certainly in the context of the challenges that affordable housing residents are feeling, this is a potential for there has been cost increase for those units. At the same time, the penetration, the number of buildings that have been retrofitted lags significantly in low-income communities of color. And there is strong correlation with the number of buildings that have been retrofitted is much higher in whiter, wealthier communities. So it's not just important that we don't trigger displacement, it's also important that we bring the benefits of investment into affordable housing. And we do that in a comprehensive way by targeting the buildings that wouldn't otherwise move on their own, combining rental protections with direct financial support to prevent those first costs getting passed along. Next. So part of what we need to do is change the frame. There are most programs that we're seeing pop up around the country are really decarbonization, and then they think, well, what will happen if we include affordable housing, which is the top diagram. What we're saying is these are twin goals and we need to solve them both at the same time. How do we actually leverage the investment, particularly public investment, but really creating flexible, adaptable funding mechanisms that can be specifically targeted with affordable housing preservation as a key goal. Affordable housing is a fundamental building block of a resilient community. If without it, it's like if the community is a bowl and we don't have affordable housing, our community is like a sieve and people are falling through and it's a crisis situation already. So how do we use the investment from decarbonization to build value in communities that have historically been left out and break the cycle of disinvestment? For a lot more detail on all of what we're saying and a lot more detail on the analysis and the cost data, you feel free to check out our report, which is available online, and I'm happy to send you a link if that's easier. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Heather and Cameron. We have a couple of questions and I think we have time for a few questions. So please stay on, Heather and Cameron, for a couple of them. And I think the first one might be for you, Heather. The question was asked, what does first cost mean? Could you tell us what that means for the entire audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we mean by first cost is the cost to actually do the retrofit. So that's the cost to update the electrical system. You may need to rewire the whole house. And then the cost to replace the equipment that can be phased over time. So you don't have to do all the equipment or systems, you can do it but per unit. And in fact, it's more cost effective, we think, to do it in a phased way, but to prepare the base building infrastructure. Those costs, and not all of those costs are unique costs. So over time, equipment needs to be replaced anyway. So we're really talking about the difference between a new regular stove and a new electric stove. Electric stoves at this point are still more expensive. And part of this notion of market transformation is the more people who are purchasing heat pumps or electric stoves or whatever, the more the cost will come down. So subsidizing first in those places that wouldn't otherwise have that is key. But the first cost, as opposed to the operational cost, which is how much energy you use each month and how much savings you get from that.
Really great explanation. And I was wondering, Cameron, could you talk a little bit more about this concept of bottom-up market, or that is addressing the hardest hit communities first, and how that could be, one of the pathways for this transition?
Yeah, we absolutely believe that when it comes to, for example, funds going out, we believe that the first communities should be the ones who, suffer the most from these things, who are low income, who are from Black and Brown communities. We believe that especially like residential should take priority, over businesses at first. But just those sorts of things can make a huge difference in making sure that when funds are put forth, that they're going to the communities that need the most first and not as an afterthought.
Great. And Heather, you also mentioned bottom-up market transformation. Do you want to expand on that?
I think Cameron said it really well. I think we're looking at making sure that every dollar that's invested, particularly public dollars, is leveraged to provide the greatest benefit. And there's the opportunity here is to target, we're saying affordable housing. I saw the question in the chat of define affordable housing. There's many ways to define it. In our study, we looked at both regulated and naturally occurring affordable housing. We didn't look at particular thresholds. We just were looking at costs and first costs and operational costs in the context of communities and households that are rent burdened. As part of any policy initiative, we'd have to set, what do you mean by affordable housing? How do we account for and even understand naturally occurring affordable housing? And design programs that are flexible enough and targeted enough to really penetrate into places where historically energy programs have not had a lot of adoption.
Okay, great. I see one more question here, and I think I can answer that one. Where can we find a copy of the report that discusses the stats on the survey conducted by Lane? You can find the Lane report and the AREP report in the program that we provided that's also in the chat space. I want to know if either of you has any questions or additional comments that you'd like to add.
I just saw a quick question in the chat. If it would be helpful for me to answer the difference between electrification and decarbonization.
That would be
and the role of efficiency in that, which I think is a really important piece of this. Mm-hmm. Decarbonization is a general term where we're talking about removing fossil fuels from the energy supply overall. As we move the grid towards more and more renewables and we move away from fossil fuels at the grid scale, then we have the opportunity to leverage that cleaner energy at the building scale by looking at where we're actually burning natural gas within our homes. That's a fossil fuel that we're combusting inside our homes. So as we move in California, we're moving pretty rapidly towards grid decarbonization to the point that it actually is much more efficient and low carbon to move towards electrification at the building scale. So electrification is actually that specific transition from natural gas to electric appliances and equipment within the home or within the building. We see efficiency as fundamentally integrated and important. So just because now you're getting clean energy from the grid doesn't mean now it's fine to just use as much as you want, because the grid doesn't have that much capacity. We won't get there in that way. So we must integrate efficiency. And one of the recommendations that we make is that the potential for funds and programs that are reaching out to, particularly for affordable housing, but really across the board, allow for both efficiency and weatherization, which means protecting the house from heat and cold, essentially making it more efficient, as well as electrification be all allowed as a broader pool. We need them together and they need to be linked.
Beautiful. And I see a lot more really wonderful comments here. And one I can address right now is all of the recordings and the slides, etc., will be received by email from the Liberty Hill Foundation. So just look for that after the session is over. And even folks who couldn't make it tonight will be getting that. I just want to, before I end and thank everyone, I just want to repeat what we mentioned at the very first launch is we aren't talking about green affordable housing and transition of renewable energy systems in very affordable housing because it's the morally right thing to do. That's not the only reason. We're not just doing that out of charity either. It's because we will not get to climate solutions, period. We won't save the planet, period, if everybody isn't engaged, particularly the most historically disinvested. So once we recognize that and we embrace that concept, that we can actually begin to dream of really reaching our goals of climate solutions. Otherwise, it's just a few of us feeling really great about putting solar panels on our rooftops and doing the right thing, but that's not going to get us to the end game or to the prize of actually achieving our goals in the climate world. So thank you both so much for reiterating those concepts and teaching us a lot more about what we need to do and the possible pathways to get there and why we need to do it in this equitable approach and with these equitable pathways. We're going to talk about green and healthy affordable housing for tenants and ratepayers. So take it away, Chelsea.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marta. As Marta said, I'm Chelsea Kirk. I'm a research and policy analyst at Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. We are a membership-based tenants' rights organization in South Los Angeles. Last year, we published a report that looked at the potential impact of building decarbonization on tenants in LA. And tonight, I'm going to spend some time talking about the contents of that report. Next slide, please. So when thinking about the benefits and risks of decarbonization for tenants in Los Angeles, we first need to really understand the conditions that tenants are living under right now. It's really hard to be a tenant in LA right now, especially if you are low income. Our city is in the midst of a housing crisis that has been exacerbated by COVID-19, escalating market rents, a shortage of affordable housing, and a rise in corporate ownership of our rental stock has contributed to high rates of rent burden, eviction, and displacement. A report on rent burden by USC surveyed certain high poverty communities in LA and found that 73% of tenants in those areas are rent burdened, with 48% of them spending half of their income on rent. According to the latest regional housing needs assessment, LA needs to build 184,000 units of affordable housing. And presently, 67% of our rental market is owned by private equity firms and other investment vehicles. A lack of adequate tenant protections and enforcement has meant that under these conditions, tenants, such as the tenants who come to Sage's clinic, experience harassment, illegal eviction, and displacement by landlords really eager to take advantage of climbing market values. Next slide, please. And so the transition away from fossil fuels poses risks to tenants if policymakers do not take care to consider the crisis I just described. And these risks include just some key risks: greater rent burden for households already struggling to pay rent, displacement of low-income tenants, and greater corporate ownership of our rental housing. Next slide, please. And these risks exist because decarbonization is expensive. It can be expensive when considering the price for all new electric appliances, energy efficiency improvements, gas disconnection, panel upgrades, and the labor costs to do all of this work. A retrofit can cost more than $20,000 per unit of housing. Next slide, please. And under our current laws, tenants could be footing the bill for this. How much tenants are impacted depends really on whether they are rent controlled or not. But even for those protected by our local rent control, rents can be increased by up to 10% for certain building upgrades because of existing cost recovery programs. Tenants protected by the state's rent control law, known as AB 1432, have less protections and can actually be evicted for substantial remodels of the home. And then tenants in new buildings no older than 15 years have no protections at all from rent increases and evictions. Next slide, please.
Oh, Chelsea, one moment, please. Sorry, do you mind just speaking a little bit slower just for our interpreters? I would really appreciate that. Sorry to interrupt you.
No worries, of course.
Thank you so much.
So I want to focus on the rent stabilization ordinance because it covers more than half of our rental housing stock in LA. And so this law protects tenants that live in buildings that were built before 1978 from rent increases and evictions. This law has helped to preserve affordability, prevent displacement, and keep rents low without subsidies. However, as I said, despite its protections, property owners are allowed to increase the rent of these tenants in order to recoup the costs of certain types of building retrofits. Next slide, please. And so the rent stabilization ordinance has 4 cost recovery programs that allow landlords to pass the cost of building upgrades onto tenants. All of these programs spread the cost out over the length of a renter's tenancy. So while rent stabilized tenants are not faced with large upfront costs of building retrofits, they could be absorbing the cost over time through a monthly increase in their rent that would need to be approved by the city. The primary renovation work program represents the greatest rent surge in the case of a retrofit, and it allows up to a 10% increase in rent, and it is a permanent increase. So even if the full cost of a retrofit is recouped, that rent increase is permanent regardless. And so
Chelsea, for a second, we actually have good time. So if you want to take it down another notch, just take a breath between statements, that'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So rent increases associated with these cost recovery programs are, in addition to already allowable annual rent increases of 3 to 5% per year, as well as fees tied to like a code enforcement fee and a rent registration fee, which tenants are also responsible for on an annual basis. So for tenants already struggling with rent burden, a rent increase associated with decarbonization could make it even harder for them to be able to afford housing. Next slide, please. So decarbonization could also put tenants at higher risk of displacement for reasons other than greater rent burden. Because of the RSO's vacancy decontrol provision, landlords are allowed to actually reset rents to market rate after a tenant vacates the unit. And this creates a financial incentive for landlords to evict low-income tenants to earn higher profits. And so if property owners are left to pay for the full upfront cost of decarbonization, they could be motivated to seek new higher paying tenants to offset those upfront costs, especially when considering that the difference in annual rent collected from a tenant paying low rents and one paying market rents could actually be equal to the cost of a retrofit. Next slide, please. So harassment is a common tactic used by landlords to illegally evict low-income tenants. Through harassing conduct, landlords are able to sidestep eviction protections and actually drive tenants to move out voluntarily. We see this a lot at Sage, a lot of members who are subject to harassment. And when I say harassment, what am I talking about? It looks like many different things. It basically, the objective is to diminish the quality of life for the tenant living in the home and drive them to move out. So that way they don't have to like try to formally evict them, especially if they have no reason to. So this could look like taking away parking. It could look like shutting off utilities. It could look like locking a tenant out of their home and changing the locks, or issuing a fake eviction notice. And if tenants aren't aware of their rights, they could just take that notice to be true and just move out voluntarily, even though they have rights and they can stay. It could also look like being offered and pressured to accept a buyout, like a cash for keys buyout, to hand over the keys for a sum of money that isn't going to help them afford housing, especially considering how market rates climb over the years. Next slide, please. Another thing to be concerned about is how decarbonization could lead to the corporate consolidation of our rental housing market. Without targeted subsidies, decarbonization could potentially lead to more corporate ownership of housing if small landlords are confronted with the high cost of decarb and unable to afford it. A likely scenario could be that they just put their buildings up for sale, really creating an opportunity for corporations to acquire their properties. As I said earlier, 67% of our rental housing stock is owned by corporate landlords and investment vehicles who regard housing first and foremost as a financial asset to extract profit from for their investors. And central to that corporate landlord business model is tenant mistreatment. Research shows that corporate landlords evict tenants at higher rates than smaller landlords. They are the worst code violators in LA County, and they participate in rent and fee gouging a lot more than smaller landlords. Next slide, please. So those are some of the potential risks that decarbonization presents, but it also presents many great opportunities to improve the quality of life for tenants in Los Angeles. Next slide, please. One is improved health. right? Natural gas appliances create unhealthy indoor and outdoor air quality. The health effects of natural gas in the home include respiratory issues like bronchitis and asthma. And so by eliminating those natural gas appliances through the conversion to all electric, indoor air quality improves, and so does health. Next slide, please. Decarbonization could also improve housing quality. Many low-income renters in Los Angeles suffer from housing quality issues that contribute to health problems and disease. These are issues such as mold, pest infestations, or uncomfortable temperatures from poor insulation, like in older buildings. And so if approached holistically, decarbonization is really an opportunity not only to make the home all electric, but also to remediate some of these indoor environmental health hazards and improve quality of housing. Next slide, please. And lowering energy bills is also a key opportunity as well. 21% of renters in LA are energy burdened and spending 6% of their income on energy bills. 11% are severely energy burdened and spending 10% of their income on energy bills. So decarbonization really presents an opportunity to reduce energy burden. However, to yield the most bill savings, decarbonization retrofits should really include a combination of deep energy efficiency, electrification, and like solar panels, and other site-specific measures when feasible. Next slide, please. In February and March of this year, SAGE hosted 4 focus groups. We spoke with 44 tenants about decarbonization. These were tenants from the South LA area, Westlake, Boyle Heights, and Lincoln Heights. And so I just wanted to share a few things that we heard in these focus groups. So one is that tenancy as being the greatest benefit of decarbonization is improved health for themselves and their families. 50% of tenants reported this. 38% said fighting climate change was the greatest benefit in their view. 7% said making housing more resilient to the impacts of climate change, and 4% said improving housing quality. The greatest concern by far overwhelmingly was cost, with 60% of the tenants in our focus group saying that was the #1 concern, followed by eviction, 26%, 13% said harassment, and none saw construction or the disruption construction brings as a concern. Next, please. Other just key things we heard and folks reported on. So 52% said that they did not have an AC unit in their home. And of those who did not have an AC unit in their home, 56% reported the reason is not being able to afford one. 78% reported having habitability issues in their home. These are issues like mold, pests, broken windows, other issues like that. And then 61% reported having unpaid energy bills. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to share some quotes of the focus groups to just give you an idea of how some tenants are thinking about this. So I'll just read one. This is from Fabiola. I think this is good. Why? So we can help our planet. It helps, but I am concerned about the electric stoves. If electricity is already expensive, imagine if everything is electric. From Isabel, what concerns me is that the owners will take advantage of this and kick us out. They use the excuse of having to construct the apartments to raise our rents. It's beautiful, all of this, but the cost is concerning. It's going to affect us. Rolando, everything sounds nice, but to be honest, we don't know the economic impact it would take on us. The president said to slow down the climate crisis, but for us, poor people, to buy the electric stove, imagine the bill, it will be so expensive. And Gloria, first and foremost, to take out the heater that we have a very old heater, and to put in one that is electrical, there's going to have to be construction. Where I live, everything is older. And then last, Betty, if he, the landlord, is going to install an appliance in the house and it's worth $5,000, he's going to want me to put $2,500 down, which is not feasible for me. This is what they did here. They installed pipes underneath our home and each tenant had to pay $500, and there are 30 tenants here. So I'll conclude with that. Thank you, and I will pass it on to Blanca.
Blanca de la Cruz.
Yes.
Thank you so much, from the California Housing Partnership.
Thank you, everyone, and good evening. My California Housing Partnership provides technical assistance to nonprofit affordable housing providers, and our policy advocacy focus on ensuring that affordable housing and their low-income residents receive the benefits of low-income, of clean energy programs. Next slide, please. I want to highlight 3 features of affordable housing and specifically subsidized affordable housing to provide a context before going into some insights that we received from the partnership's second affordable housing building decarbonization that occurred last year. And I'll end with sharing about 2 new building decarbonization programs that are available in the city of Los Angeles for affordable housing providers that will help address some of these concerns. And the first feature that I want to highlight is the structure of affordable housing directly impacts affordable housing providers' ability to pay for upfront building decarbonization upgrades. So first, to build new affordable housing or to do extensive upgrades require assembling multiple public capital subsidy programs to pay for construction cost. Capital subsidies are usually a mix of federal, state, and local funding sources, as well as grants and loans and investment programs such as the low-income housing tax credit program. And in exchange for this funding, nonprofit and for-profit housing providers agree to usually what is now a 55-year rent restriction that is tied to the property to allow for and follow strict tenant income limits and rents. So affordable housing serves various tenant subpopulations and providers are required to provide tailored tenant services. The result is that affordable housing operates within a complex mix of regulations and timelines that have particular needs that make it particularly challenging to pay for mandated upgrades without the proper subsidies in place to help pay for those. Next slide. The second important feature in affordable housing is that is used in affordable housing built with capital subsidies is that they must follow the 30% rule, meaning that tenants pay no more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. Affordability levels are based on the county's area median income limits as determined annually by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most affordable housing programs have a 60% AMI or below requirement. For example, a household of 3 persons earning in the Los Angeles County earning $63,840 a year would be at 60% AMI, and the allowed rent would be plus utilities together for a 1-bedroom cannot exceed $1,330 a month. Annually, the tenant and affordable housing providers must conduct annual tenant income certification to ensure that tenants do not pay more than 30% of their income for both rent and utilities. Next slide, please. The third feature is has to do with monthly utilities, right? As part of this calculation, a monthly utility allowance schedule must be used by affordable housing providers. And there's a few different types of utility allowances. One of the most common is issued by public housing authorities. And the example here is by the Los Angeles City Housing Authority. So continuing the example for a family of 3 at 60% AMI, in this example, we would subtract $98 for utilities, and that is based on the unit size and the features of the unit, right? The utilities that the residents pay. And in this case, we would subtract $98 from the overall allowed maximum rent And to calculate the actual rent that the tenant would pay would be $1,232. So as you can see, subsidized affordable housing operates within strict rent limits and utility allowances. Next slide, please. Now this matters, it's a lot of detail, but it matters in affordable housing because oftentimes the public housing authority's utility allowance is actually set higher than residents' actual utility bill. And even if an affordable housing provider wants to make improvements, they're not able to recover the savings from those upgrades. And lowering the utility allowance to reflect actual electrification upgrades would help reduce the split incentive without adversely affecting residents because the allowed rent remains the same. Next slide. And now I'll transition to some of the insights from the Affordable Housing Summit. To begin, we had a mix of participants of nonprofits and housing authorities participate, including from the city of Los Angeles. And they indicated that one of the, it's really important to avoid unintended consequences that there be alignment between decarbonization mandates and affordable housing programs. They also indicated that there should be different timelines for decarbonizing new construction affordable housing versus existing buildings due to the many barriers that still exist for electrifying existing buildings. Also, there should be interim exemptions for existing affordable housing because some of them may lack the space or capacity for electrification technologies, as well as some exemptions for historical buildings, and also for properties where the energy costs for the tenants will rise significantly. Next slide, please. Attendees also indicated that paying for upfront costs for electrification retrofits remains a barrier for affordable housing providers. And the utility allowance schedules that include newer electrification technologies are needed to help alleviate the cost barrier, including for schedules should include heat pump space heaters, heat pump water heaters, and a battery storage. So just really be more updated to reflect the technologies that are used and now for electrification. Clean energy programs, clean energy programs should also emphasize lowering operating costs and tenants, lowering tenants' utility bills to make sure that there is no to make the case for building decarbonization. And a robust technical assistance is needed for affordable housing providers to create a broad range of experienced staff, create internal capacity and knowledge around building decarbonization. And overall, most affordable housing providers understand the need for building decarbonization, and but they want to be able to do it in a way that does not negatively impact affordable housing's long-term financial sustainability or increase tenants' energy burden. But I will end with some positive news. So the last slide, please. Yes. So here I just wanted to share that starting this year, Los Angeles affordable housing providers will have access to 2 new building decarbonization programs. And I won't go in through the details, but just wanted to highlight that there's the BUILD program. It's a state program that is now available to electrify new construction affordable housing. And next quarter, we anticipate having LADWPs launch their new program, multifamily program, the California Affordable Multifamily Retrofit Program for existing low-income rental housing. These are important first steps to address the many concerns that affordable housing providers have But there still needs to be a lot more work done around alignment between decarbonization policies and affordable housing programs. That is it for me.
Great. Thank you, Blanca and Chelsea. Now we have some time for Q&A, and we did get a few questions up here. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and ask the first one. The first one asks, are the electrical grids in these areas able to handle the added users if they go from gas to electric? Is improving the capacity of these electrical plants part of the effort? Megan Ross did answer this in the chat. And I believe, let me see. I'm trying to look for her answer in the chat, but would any of you like to take that, or I can also try to respond? It's a question really about the grid's capacity to handle the transition from gas to electric. Well, I think, just to answer really quickly here, and Megan, if you're there, please feel free to step in. And Megan Ross is the mayor's climate advisor who has been advising us throughout the sessions. The grid itself is transitioning over to all renewable energy sources, and Los Angeles happens to be one of the most resilient cities of California, who has actually been asked to support the statewide California grid. So I think that Los Angeles is well positioned to transition into a renewable energy era. And so that I don't think that there is any doubt that we could do that in Los Angeles. What we wanted to address here more than anything else is how we do that in a way that has equity as a through line, that doesn't negatively impact middle income and low income households that can barely afford this post-pandemic recovery. So that's my answer for that question. And the second question is very similar. Are the capital improvements, from the capital improvements that come to mind, the cost will be passed on to the tenants unless electrification is not allowed in the HDLA? Has this been addressed? Do you think you can address that one, Blanca?
Is HDLA, does that mean the housing department? I'm not sure what.
Probably. I don't know if oh, she answered it in the chat. I don't know exactly, but let's just answer the first part. Capital improvements come to mind. The cost will be passed. Will the cost be passed on to tenants?
So as I mentioned, in subsidized affordable housing, there is whether a property goes through an energy efficiency retrofit or not, the allowed rent amount is the same, remains the same. So they would not, while their actual rent amount may go up a little bit to adjust for more efficient utilities, they will not pay more than 30% of their income. So I don't know if the question was trying alluding to perhaps increase. They would not go over the 30% allowed. So and those rents in affordable housing, they are adjusted annually based on the area medium income schedules that are issued annually.
Great. And then, thank you. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Yeah, and so that's for, Blanca, you spoke to, deed restricted tenants. For rent stabilized tenants who are not in deed restricted affordable housing, the different components that make up like a decarbonization retrofit, whether that's like an appliance being replaced or an electrical grid being upgraded, the nature of this work could be subjected to existing cost recovery programs, likely the primary renovation work program or the capital improvement program in the city of LA under the housing department, which tenants would then see an increase in rent. Those, applications for those rent increases do need to be approved by the city housing department. And so that's why it's really important that LAHD gets involved in these conversations and is a part of the policymaking program.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then I did find Megan's response here. She says there is an emphasis on local grids. The emphasis on local grids is closely related to LADWP's long-term planning with LA 100 and the strategic long-term resource plan. So rooftop solar can be part of the building decarbonization, but it doesn't always have to be. I think the panelists have mentioned how important energy efficiency is and other options for renewable energy transition. So I think that's accurate, that we absolutely have a plan in LA to transition to renewable energy, and it doesn't always have to be about a solar rooftop. And then,
Right, Marta, pardon me 1
Yes.
second. I'm just going to intervene on behalf of the interpreters. If we can all just collectively just maybe reduce the pace of speaking. I'm trying to keep on doing this. Just want to
I
ensure that
apologize.
we're making sure we're incorporating everyone. There's no rush. We're all good on time. Dale. All good, mi tocayo, Andres? Yeah, excellent. Cool. I see a thumbs up. Oh, back to you, Marta. If you can repeat the question just a bit slower.
Sure. Gracias, Andres. I think the final question is, how do we increase the understanding of the need to decarbonize buildings so that our communities get the benefits? That's a great question. So basically, I think Blanca mentioned that there really is a need to promote the understanding of why decarbonization is necessary, so that the decarbonization can happen equitably across the city. Because as has happened with other benefits in the past and rates and discounts, people who understand the benefits get the discounts first and the rebates first. But if you don't, then you kind of left with the total cost. So I think that's what the question is alluding to. Chelsea, I think it's a question of like, how do we convey the benefits of decarbonizing buildings? And I think Sage did that beautifully by having focus groups, for example. So if you can talk a little bit about why you promoted the use of focus groups for even Climate Equity LA.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we really wanted to hear from the members that we work with at Sage and also other tenants in Los Angeles, like directly about what they thought about this, right? We can all, as policymakers and advocates, talk amongst ourselves and read the data and the reports about, okay, what's the best way to decarbonize equitably? But hearing it from the tenants was really meaningful for us. And like just hearing people share their own experience of like what their relationship with their own landlord is like, they're able to best assess how they think this is going to impact them, whether they think their landlord is going to use this as an opportunity to take advantage of them, or whether they think, wow, this is going to be a really good thing for me and my family. And we're also able through the focus groups to understand like, yeah, different nuances. Like some people were really concerned about electric stoves, which is, there hasn't been a lot of space made for that in this conversation. Like some people just don't want electric stoves or electric appliances. And like when we're talking about concerns like displacement and rent burden, we forget about some of these smaller things. And so it was really important for us to be able to talk with those 44 tenants, and like they each were able to have a lot of time to speak and share their views. So.
Great. So as an overall suggestion, I think that what I'd like to do with that recommendation is next year for the Climate Equity LA series, integrate a lot more focus groups. And we're actually taking recommendations from those who are listening on other ideas to better integrate the grassroots so that they understand why this renewable energy transition is the topic of conversation, so that they understand how they can benefit from it and not be the victims of it. So I think it's a really, and we heard this from Sage and other CBOs that told us, this Climate Equity LA series is wonderful, but it's not going to reach everyone. And we need a mechanism by which to convey and communicate to everyone. So the more you diversify these opportunities to convey information to the public at large, the better off all of us will be, because we really need the buy-in of the larger community. So thank you both so much for this really enlightening and useful information. And now I think we're going to transition to Andres Gonzalez for the small group breakouts. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate all the speakers today. Thank you so much, Marta. So right now we're about to enter breakout rooms where we'll have time to kind of hear your feedback, hear your reflections. We'll have 3 basic questions to guide us. Each breakout room will have 1 facilitator and 1 note taker who will just kind of help guide the conversation. There will be a lot of points that come up today. If there's a point that may be better addressed offline or something like that, we encourage facilitators and note takers to use the bike rack tool, meaning that we will kind of put this as a space to a list of questions that may come up that we may not be able to answer directly right now, but that we want to address offline via a broader email. So I'm going to share the 3 questions in the chat, and we are going to have about 30 minutes or so. So we'll be coming back at around 7:35. I'm going to share the questions in the chat, but I'm going to repeat them verbally. So the first question is, in your view, what are some of the benefits of building decarbonization, or also clean energy buildings if you prefer that? In your view, what are some of the benefits of building decarbonization related to housing affordability and tenant rights? The next question is, what are some challenges related to building decarbonization related to housing affordability and tenants' rights? And then finally, the last question, and the one that takes a little bit more time, what are some of the things that could be done to make sure building decarbonization is equitable for you and your community? I've shared those in the chat. Facilitators and note takers also have access to those questions in the chat. So I think with that, unless there's any other additional comments, Marta, do you have any additional points? Then shall we open up the breakout rooms? Oh, one additional question. For Spanish speakers, please just raise your hand or write in the chat that you need to be in the Spanish breakout rooms, and we will put you in the Spanish breakout rooms. Thank you.
Unos 30 segundos más mientras terminamos.
Un segundito. Gracias, Ray. Ray just opened up the channels for interpretation again. Recording is back on. Thank you so much. I'm seeing we got a couple breakout rooms that are still kind of coming back. Folks are kind of wrapping up some conversation, so we'll give them about like 10 more minutes or 10 more seconds or so. And when all folks are back, I'm going to ask some facilitators, if they can kind of share some of the takeaways that came up in their rooms. Perfect. Okay. I think we're all back. Much appreciate that, everyone. Thank you so much. I know there were a little snafus there with the breakout room, so I appreciate everyone's patience. I think if I can just ask for 3 facilitators, Alex, Jacid, if you want to kind of start us off on some of the takeaways for your breakout rooms without naming anyone, just kind of like what were some of the highlights, priorities that folks brought up?
Yeah, thanks. So some of the opportunities that we started with, one was that we can use decarbonization to reduce utility debt, as well as addressing utility affordability and other EJ issues. We also talked about the possibility of pairing retrofits together with building decarbonization to make sure that we're sort of taking a whole home approach. We talked about the opportunity for good jobs and how that will make housing more affordable from the consumer sort of perspective. And we also talked about sort of rate hikes that are being considered by SoCalGas to fund some other projects and how that relates to affordability. In terms of the challenges, the main ones we recognized were sort of the infrastructure burden and the cost, and what that will mean for communities. Talking about how rebates aren't really going to cut it, because if you don't have the upfront cost, then a lot of these retrofits are cost prohibitive. We also talked about the risk of displacement and evictions being sort of something that was really important to several of the members in our group. And then finally, in terms of sort of what we can do or suggestions, there was a strong push for renters to be at the table when these decisions are being made. And we talked a lot about sort of the lack of agency that renters have, especially low income renters. We talked about the need for rooftop solar and sort of the education and information sharing that needs to be part of these efforts to make sure people can access this information and the programs themselves. And let's see, anything we talked a lot about this, so I'm just trying to be quick. We also talked about the need to prepare our communities to be ready to collect funding from the government, from the federal government as well as state government, because there seems to be a lot of funding around for this. So yeah, those are some of the highlights.
Really appreciate it. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, so definitely hearing jobs, concerns around like infrastructure burdens, and kind of need for more rebates, as well as kind of the need for, centering renters, tenants in a lot of these processes, particularly as it relates to displacement and ways to use kind of like federal spending, to name a few. So really appreciate those points. If I can ask Francisco Arvizu, sorry, Francisco, if I didn't pronounce your last name correctly, but if you want to just kind of, correct me and also share any takeaways from your group.
It's all good. My last name is Arvizu, but it's all good. Thank you. So yeah, for the first question, the benefits of building decarbonization, similar to Alex, our group agrees that it benefits our health. It also provides jobs. And there was one more thing. Well, those are the two main tops. And also it's going to help us improve some of our older buildings as well. For the second question, some of the challenges related to building decarbonization, there's going to be a lot of displacement, gentrification, and incentives for landlords to evict tenants. So those are also going to be some of the challenges. What are some things that could be done to make sure building decarbonization is equitable for you and your community? Well, getting the state involved, maybe to provide incentive programs to fund some of these, I guess, modernization. Also, I believe for, and also outreach, also we should provide educational workshops for tenants and also for, I guess, even for landlords to make sure that landlords are not going to take advantage of the situation and start breaking the rules and violate the rights of tenants. Those are some of the main things that we share in our group, group number 6. And thank you all for sharing in our group.
Dale, Francisco, thank you. So definitely hearing again, like the elements, benefits around health and jobs, challenges around gentrification, and that it kind of incentivizes displacement, as well as kind of really getting tenants and landlords, workshopping, discussing kind of how to prevent some of this displacement, as well as the ways that, similar to, I think Alex's group mentioned, ways that state funding or federal funding can kind of become involved to help ground some of these processes. Really appreciate that. And last, mi socia Alicia Morales, would you mind kind of sharing some of the takeaways from your group? Ray, if we can just make sure that Alicia can unmute herself.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So I was in group 3 with my partner, Andrea, and a lot of similar things that Alex and Francisco mentioned, including like benefits to decarbonization as it's related to health and dealing with issues like indoor pollution, and seeing much needed upgrades in older buildings, especially RSL units. In terms of challenges, I think it was very loud and clear that cost was just a huge issue, and the concern of cost being passed down to tenants, and of course that leading to an already difficult situation around displacement and eviction, and preserving affordability, of course. In terms of our So I'm just scrolling through our notes. In terms of some ideas to kind of address how to move forward equitably, we discussed, oh shoot, where are they? Yeah, okay, sorry. So we discussed, you know, the just kind of the invasiveness of construction, and also, you know, just concerns around costs in particular, maybe to like mom and pop landlords. And so maybe even looking at like some sort of relocation assistance program, or identifying units that tenants can use as these modification and retrofits are taking place. We also discussed using existing programs through LADWP that can help, you know, install some of these changes, like direct install programs that can speed up this process. And then we also talked about just the high costs, the first cost that was discussed in the presentations, and trying to find a way to either support, you know, funding that cost, or subsidizing it. And I think that's it for now.
Yeah, that's super rich. No, thank you so much, Alicia. Definitely, again, I think we're going back to hearing the element around health, particularly as it relates to indoor air pollution, you know, how it impacts old buildings and SROs, which are especially some of the most vulnerable, ways that those costs are kind of passed down to tenants, right? How to preserve affordability, and also kind of that element around discussing the invasiveness of construction. So ways that maybe we can, programs can support and assist relocation processes to ensure kind of a long-term living, you know, and particularly maybe LADWP support with direct install. So super appreciate that. Thank you so much, Francisco, Alicia, Alex. And with that, we're just going to do one little last kind of outro exercise. Raymond, if you can, or Ray, if you can share the Mentimeter. So for folks who aren't familiar, Mentimeter is just kind of way to pull, you know, in terms of questions and different ways. You may have seen this in the first workshop. If folks can go to menti.com and use the code 78648046, I can provide the link shortly. But we're curious, what were some of the takeaways that stood out to you in the panels or in the breakout rooms? If you don't like to use Menti, you can also just use the chat, and we can also just kind of, you know, see the different points that come up. And again, the question is, what takeaways stood out the most to you from today's workshop? Thank you so much, Giselle, much appreciate that. Yeah, and as folks kind of respond, we'll see some pop-ups, you know, and also feel free to just use the chat if that's more comfortable with you. Yeah. So seeing utility allowances changing as a way of addressing the split incentive problem, city ensuring that decarbonization should not be something that's passed down onto other tenants, right? Need to save money. I'm just going to quickly go through the chat. Maybe some of these are additional points from before, but seeing public bank and how public bank LA and how it can help fund decarb, the need for education and involving schools, right? I see a latecomer referencing enhanced infrastructure finance districts. I'm not super familiar with that, but we should kind of make a note of that too in any takeaways from today. Avoid passing along electrification costs to tenants, more protection for tenants, you know, saving money, displacement being a huge risk, right? I think we're seeing that as a recurring element. You know, equitable solutions, relocation assistance programs being a really big one. Important. Thank you so much, I'm seeing a lot of responses coming through. Feel free to keep tagging them. You know, electrification and habitability of housing needing to be addressed together, kind of those intersections. Yeah, feel free. We're going to be using this Menti as a way to kind of also see other ways that thoughts and priorities kind of came up. And this will be a really helpful tool for us to kind of see those like seeds that start kind of popping up in today's conversations. So feel free to just keep on populating this. I know we're at 7:47, so I just want to be mindful of everyone's time. And with that, thank you so much for all of these points. They're looking through them, they're incredible. Marta, I think I will return this to you just to be mindful of time. And thank you so much, everyone. Oh, Marta, you are muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Well, as I'm transitioning, please feel free to continue to comment on Mentimeter. That's really valuable information. I wanted to also take this opportunity to thank all of our presenters from SAGE, ARUP, the California Housing Partnership, and Lane. So that would be Cameron Hurt, Blanca de la Cruz, Heather Rosenberg, and Chelsea Kirk. You all did a phenomenal job, and we really appreciate the data. And you will get this information, the recording, the PDFs, and the program itself via email, so you won't lose that data. And again, thank you to all of our presenters. Wanted to talk briefly about what I heard was the takeaway today, that there are definitely benefits, but there are also fears and challenges for decarbonizing and electrifying our buildings and homes. But in order to do justice to an equitable pathway for building decarbonization, we have to ensure that we look at both the benefits and the challenges. And one of the benefits that stood out to me that is really important to me is how we can improve the health of our communities by retrofitting the older buildings in particular. Because if we had the opportunity to finance and retrofit older buildings to make them not just climate adapted, but comfortable homes to live in that would withstand the climate disasters that often come to LA, whether that's extreme heat or the pervasive smoke during wildfire season. Those are all really important and key benefits, because we know that those extreme heat scenarios and the smoke scenarios disproportionately impact the lowest income communities. So we definitely need that public health perspective, but we need the public financing pathways for building owners and for tenants. And like Blanca said, there are some structures that currently exist right now for affordable housing programs that we can use as a model to expand for the large scale the city has to apply it to ensure that tenants aren't disproportionately impacted, displaced, or gentrified, or even have their rent increased or their utility costs increased. There's all of those potential challenges. In terms of additional things to consider, we need to have free very available information on subsidies and incentives. And sometimes subsidies and incentives are clearly not enough. We need to move beyond the subsidy and incentive model and just figure out what the cost benefit analysis is for our lowest income community members and middle income community members, so that we can afford the transition. Because as we've said earlier, if not everyone is involved in the transition, then there's no climate solution. We're just spinning our wheels and getting some people on board, but some is not enough. We need to increase the agency, education, and information with language justice of this information, so that's readily available and people can engage in the conversation that we're having today, but directly with the utility companies like LADWP to make their knowledge known and their wisdom known and their recommendations known. I also heard here that we needed more than rooftop solar, but we need to also increase energy efficiency and resilience amongst our buildings and home. It was an extremely rich conversation. I stepped into one of the small group breakouts. I was very much impressed with the talent of the facilitator and the talent of the participants. So I do hope that everybody feels the same way that I do, that it was a really rich conversation. And finally, I want to make a couple of announcements. One is that after we finish here today, you will receive a survey from us. And the reason that survey is so important is because, like I mentioned earlier, the data that we collect from you, the recommendations that we collect from you are all going to be part of a final report that's going to go to the Climate Emergency Mobilization Commission, which is going to create what we're calling the Equitable Climate Action Roadmap. And that's where you will be a part of history, and you will help us make recommendations to City Council and to LADWP and everybody that needs to hear the kinds of solutions that you were recommending today. And I want to say a final thank you to all of our facilitators, our amazing note takers, to the Liberty Hill Foundation, to the organizations I mentioned earlier who were presenters today, but also all of our anchor organizations, and of course, the City Council and the Board of Public Works, and everybody who's been a part of creating this model, this blueprint that I think will help transform the way that we transition into a renewable energy era. So thank you all so very much. And please don't forget to fill out that survey, whether it's today or tomorrow. Thank you.